Good morning, everyone, and welcome. My name is Ryan Berg, and I'm the Director of the Americas Program at CSIS. Thank you for joining us today for an important conversation on El Salvador's 2024 elections. Before we formally begin, let's take care of logistics. This discussion will last approximately 60 minutes. Following the panelists' remarks and a moderated discussion, we will field questions from the audience. If you have a question, please submit questions by clicking on the Ask Live Questions link on the event webpage itself. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. This coming Sunday, February 4th, millions of Salvadorans will vote in an election where the result seems a foregone conclusion. All polls point unfailingly toward a landslide victory for incumbent President Nayib Bukele. The circumstances around his election bid are very clear, involving a packed Supreme Court which ruled to revise the Constitution and permit Bukele to stand for re-election. The president's consistent 80% plus approval ratings suggest that his personal popularity far outweigh constitutional scruples. Just as the outcome of the election is known, the source of Bukele's popularity is also quite manifest. Over the course of nearly 3 years, he has waged a nonstop war on gangs in El Salvador. The result has been seen both in its success at lowering the homicide rate, as well as in its humanitarian toll, which has placed nearly 2% of the country's adult population behind bars. Our aim in hosting this morning's event is therefore not to retread these well-established points, but to delve into the consequences of the unconstitutional re-election, its implications for El Salvador's democracy and U.S. policy, as well as shed light on what February 4th means for the legislature in addition to the presidency. Indeed, as the title of the event suggests, there exists a real possibility that in El Salvador, the opposition won't manage to win any seats in the country's legislature. And even if it does, that presence may be token at best, leaving few meaningful constraints on Bukele's executive power for yet another 5 years. This morning, we hope to unpack the various likely scenarios that will unfold on Sunday and look beyond and examine responses for Salvadoran civil society, the United States, and the international community. We will also take a more fine-grained look into the mechanics of El Salvador's elections and some of the recent reforms that Bukele has deployed to further tilt the playing field in his favor. To advance the conversation this morning, we are honored to be joined today by a truly superlative panel. Our first speaker is Oscar Picardo Joao. He's director of the Institute of Science, Technology, and Innovation at Francisco Gavidia University. In this position, he has overseen cutting-edge public opinion polling on key issues, candidate preferences, and voting intentions ahead of the February 4th elections. Dr. Picardo obtained his doctorate from the Universitat Oberta de Catalunya and conducted postgraduate studies at the University of Murcia and at Harvard University. Our next speaker is Máximo Zaldívar, Regional Director for Latin America and the Caribbean at the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, otherwise known as IFES. Originally from El Salvador, he has 20 years of experience in democracy, elections, and political processes. Zaldívar previously worked for the International Republican Institute, Social Impact, Union of Latin American Parties, Central American Parliament, and the Salvadoran Embassy in Guatemala. And our final speaker is Leonor Arteaga, Program Director with the Due Process of Law Foundation. In this capacity, she heads the program on impunity and grave human rights violations, leading investigations, advocacy, and monitoring and analysis on issues relating to memory, truth, justice, and guarantees for non-recurrence of past armed conflicts and current situations of state violence in Latin America. Before joining DPLF, Arteaga was Deputy Ombudsman for Children and Youth at the Office of the Ombudsman for the Defense of Human Rights. Now, rather than opening statements, I've asked each one of our panelists to respond to a particular targeted question, and we'll start with Oscar, who's going to speak or respond to my questions, rather, in Spanish because he's more comfortable in Spanish. And so, Oscar, starting with you, I want to start this event with the results of the election, which, as I mentioned, seemed to be a foregone conclusion given Bukele's quite commanding, indeed overwhelming lead in the polls. One of the biggest questions remaining is whether the opposition will be able to secure any sort of toehold in the legislature itself. Give us an overview of some of the likely scenarios that you've been tracking with your polling, and how likely is it that we are, as the event title suggests, likely to see a one-party state voted in?
Okay, thank you for invitation. The survey are clear, and indicating an hegemonic party model. Part of the opposition will be very weakened. Arena and FMLN parties, and another will possibly disappear, the little parties. Vamos, Nuestro Tiempo, Fuerza Solidaria, PCN, and PDC. The opposition did not solve the problem of the past. He did not prepare for the new scenario. He did not characterize his opponents. They have no donors, no resource. It's an unequal contest. Furthermore, the electoral reforms, the Hunt formula, and the new territorial reorganization help to concentrate the power more. Finally, the government propaganda industry is impressive, national and international. Social networks, Bukele partners, amplified and magnified everything. The asymmetry is incredible high in the opposition and the official party.
Thanks very much, Oscar. Maximo, I want to go over to you and talk about what the electoral conditions are going to be like on election day. This is something that IFES looks at in many, many countries. You're the head of Latin America at IFES. It seems that there have been a lot of changes that have happened before this election has taken place. Oscar alluded to some of them. To prevent the opposition from mounting an effective challenge, including reducing the size of the Legislative Assembly from 84 to 60 members, diluting some of the districts where the opposition support happens to be strong. Electoral conditions are often set far before Election Day, as you well know. So give our listeners a sense of some of the changes that have taken place before February 4th. Are there any other changes other than the legislature, the size of the legislature, that we should know about that will affect the election outcome, likely in Bukele's favor?
Thank you, Ryan. And thanks to CSIS for the invitation to participate in this timely and very important discussion together with two distinguished panelists and fellow Salvadorians. El Salvador's electoral system has been geared during the last 10 to 13 years, mostly by the Supreme Court through its constitutional chamber, rather than the actual elections tribunal, particularly while materializing big milestones in our electoral history, like the open and cross list, independent candidacies, and out-of-country voting. Now, in order to protect these, there was one article, 291A, which prohibited any change to the elections code 1 year prior to an election. Also, to not affect the course of the ongoing elections process by having to implement new reforms in a very short period of time, or to avoid political interest to prevail by changing the rules in their favor. Well, that's what happened when the article in mention was repealed by the National Assembly close to its deadline last year in order to make place for the reduction of seats from 84 to 60. By the way, a daring move considering that we're still using an outdated census which dates back to 2007, and to modify and expand out-of-country voting, as well as adjusting to the new special law that reduced the number of municipalities from 262 to 44. Now, the arguments to this sound very valid and convincing, right? Like the contradiction for a small country like El Salvador, which its size of only 25,000 square kilometers, to have such a large decentralization. Or because the current violent constitution of 1983 had only 60 seats, we should reverse to that one. I would say that besides a clear disregard to the peace accords of 1992, which is the closest that we have to a social pact in El Salvador, one could easily conclude that yes, the intentions behind all these changes do seem that there is a well-structured political purpose behind it. Now, I would not go as far as to say that it makes it, that the election outcome that this shapes the election's outcome in favor of Nayib Bukele, but certainly it makes it harder for an already diminished political opposition to reach elected positions. Remember, the threshold that the Elections Code mandates in order for a party to not lose its registration is a minimum of 50,000 valid votes or 100,000 valid votes if it's through a coalition. And you need to win at least one seat at the National Assembly. Finally, if you add to this, and it was already mentioned, the new Hunt formula, which favors larger parties and coalitions, it makes reaching those elected positions even harder. Now, the other significant event that is in the forecast for our electoral system, which is not yet openly discussed, at least not publicly, is the change of the magistrates at the Elections Tribunal. Their term is up in July of this year. The election code says that the parties that reach first, but also second and third place in the final vote count can designate one magistrate each. And I really don't imagine this to happen again. The new government and the incumbent party will not allow that. So they can either pass the constitutional reforms, of which there's a bill draft that has been submitted to the executive already for revision, and has a specific section that changes completely our current electoral system and follows more the line of the 2019 reforms in Honduras, which did split the then existing model of one elections tribunal by creating two separate entities, one for the jurisdictional aspects and one for the administrative one. The other way could be another sudden bill, and we have seen many of those, and there are some already early indications by some legislators about it, that it could fall in the hands of the Supreme Court designating all 5 magistrates and not only 2, as it currently is the case. Elections reform will be in the agenda of the new legislation, Ryan. That I do see coming. We not have seen the end of it. It will be a crucial component of the consolidation of Bukele's political plan, or what will be left to consolidate after upcoming Sunday. Thank you.
Maximo, thanks so much for that very comprehensive response. There's a lot there that I want to unpack in future questions to you, but I want to get Leonor into the discussion here. Thanks for waiting, Leonor. I have a 2-part question for you. The elections will provide Bukele with a new mandate to govern and an even stronger legislative majority with which to implement policies. What are the implications of 5 more years of Bukele for democracy in El Salvador? And if, as we've been discussing thus far, the opposition has a limited representation or perhaps no representation as a result of these elections, what can civil society do to provide a meaningful check against further democratic backsliding?
Thank you, Ryan, and thank you, CSIS, for this very important discussion. I think we're just beginning to see the implications of a second term of President Bukele. The re-election of Bukele will certainly solidify his control over most, or probably not all, state institutions, and will severely undermine the credibility of his government compliance with the basic democratic principles and rule of law. The adverse implications for human rights and due process cannot be understated. One immediate consequence of this control over the state is that there will be more attacks to civil society, independent media, and anyone who criticizes or think different from what the government wants everybody to think. We've already seen in this, since Bukele took office, different tactics to close civic space. First, we've identified at least 5 of these tactics, and one is there's a state of exception that has been illegally renewed for almost 2 years, and that has been used to violate human rights for a large part of the population, and also government discourse in the media aimed at stigmatizing the work of human rights defender, make them seem like the enemy, like part of the problem. Also harassment of independent journalists, as I said, any person voicing dissent or criticism, concealment and manipulation of public information, the use of vague criminal definitions that can place human rights defenders or journalists at risk, and weaponizing the powers of some government officials and application of excessive controls over the media and civil society organizations. That poses a lot of challenges for civil society organizations in El Salvador. I think we will have to think outside the box to look for alliances with international organizations, to use creative advocacy strategies with the traditional human rights international body as the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights, but also to use more the United Nations system, and to look for the support not only from the United States government, but also from other democratic governments from Latin America. The other consequence, that we anticipate is that the outcome of the election would not only shape the future of El Salvador, but will also have far-reaching implications for the region and beyond. I mean, if Bukele wins and the international community legitimizes the electoral process without acknowledging the context where the elections took place, with Bukele recurring to the Supreme Court and changing the constitution, so he could run for an election, it will send a really pernicious message and will set a bad precedent. This would, it would mean that it would lead to normalize that a president can stay in power by bypassing the law and combat crime without following due process or having an independent justice system, or negotiating with organized crimes and using torture as a means to an end of people who hasn't even had a trial. I just want to close saying that we should take some lessons from the recent experience of Guatemala. I think what happened in Guatemala shows that with the Semilla Party, shows that the opposition leaders should capitalize the unexpected window of opportunity before this window of opportunity can open. And it also means that unlike many other opposition actors, Semilla began working when the authoritarian regime in Guatemala seemed like a lost cause. So we should keep working as civil society and in close coordination with also with new political leaders.
Thank you very much, Leonor, for that response. And we have, I have a couple questions for you to follow up on what you said later in our event, particularly about Bukele and how he markets himself to the region as a model. Oscar, I want to come back to you and ask you about another electoral maneuver that we've seen Bukele take, which it has to do with the very large Salvadoran diaspora, and to say that most of the votes that are taking place in the exterior are being concentrated and packed into the San Salvador municipality. And Bukele expects to win a large majority of these diaspora votes, thus, I think, kind of overwhelming some of the opposition in San Salvador, partly with the help of these voters abroad whose votes have been concentrated in San Salvador. So how has the diaspora reacted to this, to the news that their votes will be concentrated in San Salvador? And is there a role for the diaspora to advocate for policy change in El Salvador? And if you feel more comfortable speaking in Spanish, please. Si te sientes mejor en español,
Sí,
por
mejor,
favor,
por favor.
sigue en español entonces.
Sí, si me repites, por favor, la pregunta.
So the question is whether the diaspora has said anything about the efforts to concentrate their votes within San Salvador. And second part of the question is whether there is a role for the diaspora to engage in sort of policy advocacy with the Bukele administration.
Sí, nosotros hemos medido a nivel nacional en varias oportunidades a través de encuestas y tenemos una fotografía sin el registro de votos de la diáspora. En las elecciones anteriores apenas participaron 6.000 salvadoreños y en esta, con las reformas, ya van cerca de 120.000 participantes. Muchos de esos votos a nivel legislativo se concentrarán en el departamento de San Salvador, desplazando a la mayoría de candidatos de la oposición que podrían entrar por este departamento. Sospechamos, pero no tenemos evidencia ni dato, que la mayoría de esos votos serán para el presidente Bukele y su partido, Nuevas Ideas, lo cual va a antagonizar más los resultados que proyectamos. De 60 diputados, nuestro pronóstico fue de 57 y a nivel presidencial, digamos, un 78% de votos a favor del presidente Bukele. Eso confirma el modelo que indicaba anteriormente de partido hegemónico y de una mayor concentración de poder en la figura del presidente, tanto a nivel territorial en los municipios como a nivel legislativo, como en otros ámbitos del Estado, como hemos visto en el en la Corte Suprema de Justicia, en la Fiscalía, etcétera, ¿verdad? Entonces, esa es la foto que tenemos al momento y creemos que por toda la campaña que se ha hecho, sobre todo a nivel digital, estos votos de la diáspora se van a concentrar en la figura del presidente Bukele y en su partido.
Many thanks, Oscar, for that. Maximo, I want to stick with the theme of the diaspora and ask you, already somewhere around 100,000 Salvadorans are said to have voted already in this election from abroad. And there are quite a few questions about this process and how it's going to play out, the diaspora, the very considerable diaspora that we all know El Salvador has. Many in the diaspora have encountered so-called puestos de atención. These are kind of like stations in the exterior that are run by Nuevas Ideas, but are meant to sort of sign up voters to be able to vote. But because they're run by Nuevas Ideas, they can give the misleading impression that the party is cultivating votes abroad. I think there's a major question about how the mechanics of the diaspora vote will work. Will there be an audit trail? And what is the role of the OAS in all of this? If you can just unpack elements of the diaspora vote, which is quite considerable, I think it would be very instructive for our audience.
Thank you, Ryan. Well, there's been a lot of different messages regarding the out-of-country voting. To begin with, the government started to make it look like it was the first time that this was happening, right? I remember seeing hashtags for the first time, hashtag por primera vez, which to begin with is wrong. We already had out-of-country voting since a couple of years back. But of course, it was a different methodology. It was postal voting. And as Oscar said, the participation levels have been relatively low, as it has been in most countries in Latin America, out-of-country voting through postal voting. Now, this time they definitely created a law that tried to reach younger voters, tried to reach diaspora people and tried to motivate them somehow by facilitating the vote through an internet mechanism. There's a lot to discuss if internet voting is the best way and security concerns, but just focusing on what is going on, right now 18% has voted out of the registered voters. So it seems it's a highly successful number so far, above 120, 130,000 votes casted. And if you think that we Salvadorians tend to leave things for the last minute, that there's going to be a huge turnout in the week that we have left until Sunday. And you have to add then, of course, the out-of-country voting in presence, which also will happening on elections day. The law was drafted at the National Assembly without even considering any inputs from the Elections Tribunal. I remember seeing the debates and the discussions by the Special Committee on Electoral Affairs at the National Assembly, and it was not until the last minute that I think the Elections Tribunal was invited to one of the last sessions, basically just to inform them how the law was drafted, but not to get any inputs from the technical authority that should have been provided their inputs in this kind of matters. So it has been a complex situation for the TSC to manage, but at the same time, it has been highly popular with the diaspora to be able to cast the vote, as we are seeing it in practice happening. Regarding the controls, yes, I mean, it's been difficult. There's no clear jurisdiction on how you can oversee this type of innovating voting and through this type of mechanism. And I think that maybe some political parties have taken advantage of those empty spots in the law on how to properly monitorate and control this type of voting. The specific case that you mentioned, I think, is just a smart move and opportunism to try to be there and try to guide people and try to influence how they vote. I haven't heard that they are actually telling them how to vote, but of course the mere presence of them can indicate that you're trying to try to influence your decision. But that will be up to the TSC to decide. There are complaint stages of after the elections, and we will see if some of them complaints are bring up to the TSC, and maybe something can be made about it to avoid that in future electoral processes. Now, on your last point, I really don't want to talk about other organizations like the OAS. I know they are coming down with a huge elections mission, observation mission. They have already technical special observers down here in El Salvador, and it's going to be crucial for the integrity of this process to have the presence of the OAS, of course, in El Salvador.
Thanks very much, Maximo. Very useful to talk about the mechanics of all of this. And I understand the reticence to speak on behalf of the OAS, given you work for IFES. Leonor, over to you. So the United States, I have a question about the U.S. role in all of this for you. As an outside observer, it certainly looks as though the United States has, let's say, quietly withdrawn some of its rhetoric against Bukele when it comes to some of his maneuvers domestically. Do you have any thoughts on how the United States and the international community and civil society should best confront the likely reality of another 5 years of Bukele, and how can it work to limit or place meaningful limits on some of those attacks that you mentioned in your first response, which could be coming on democracy and civil society?
I just want to say a word about the OAS because as DPLF, we do a lot of advocacy before the OAS. I think of course, it's crucial the observation of the election as part of the mandate of the OAS, which is a very traditional mechanism. The OAS always observe the elections in Latin America, but I think this is the time for the OAS to go further than this. And we've seen in the Guatemala crisis, the recent Guatemala crisis, the OAS played a key role by, working together, different states, to defend the democratic space in Guatemala. And I think now we see that there are different states, strong states in Latin America that should care about what is happening in El Salvador. And they should care because of democratic principles and because it's an important thing for Salvadorians, but not only for that reason, but because what Bukele is doing has become on some kind of model, Bukele model. We've heard that phrase, and it seems that what he's doing in El Salvador has become like the new way of combating crime, and there are at least 16 countries in Latin America that at some point a candidate or a politician or has called for their own Bukele model. So it has what Bukele is doing has become a threat for the whole region. And what the United States should do is, there's not a simple answer for that. The relation with Bukele, it's a very complex one. On one hand, he has a lot of popularity. It seems that he's improving the security situation in El Salvador, but on the other hand, he's undermining the rule of law and democracy in general. I think that the United States has claimed that they have quiet diplomacy kind of relation with El Salvador. And we, as human rights organization, the PLF and other human rights organization, we agree that the use of quiet diplomacy, private conversations are very important to continue with the dialogue and to achieve some agreements and try to have more influence. But on the other hand, it's important that the U.S., at least at some key moments, can make public demonstrations to support civil society groups and beyond that, to support democracy. And also it's important that the U.S. does not publicly seems to voice or to support Bukele's action. At the same time, it's important to continue with sanctions as the Engel list, the Magnitsky Act. I think all of that could make a difference. Still, the United States, it's a key player on what's happening in El Salvador, and I think that this power or this influence still can make some difference.
Thank you very much, Leonor. Oscar, I want to come back to you about other issues that are salient in the election. Obviously, everyone on this panel has talked about security already. We know the popularity that Bukele has gained because of Plan Bukele and some of the improved security situation in El Salvador. But I did find it very interesting that an El Faro headline last week reported that about a sixth of the Salvadoran population cannot afford to buy meat, cannot afford to buy eggs or dairy products. For some of the country's poorest families, not even rice is an option. Corn and beans are the daily fare for those who can grow them. And in the past 3 years, Alfaro said, about 200,000 people have fallen into extreme poverty, meaning they do not make enough to cover the costs of basic staples, and few report eating 3 meals per day. And so that brings the total to nearly 1 million Salvadorans who suffer from food insecurity and are struggling on the brink of starvation. How has Bukele explained this during the campaign? Has he offered a plan to address hunger, rising prices of food, and some of the other things that Salvadorans face on a day-to-day, aside from security?
Mm. Esta campaña electoral ha sido muy atípica. No hemos escuchado propuestas, no ha habido debates sobre temas técnicos o importantes. Solo ha habido una campaña de miedo para utilizando el tema de la seguridad como eje principal, ¿verdad? Que si no votan por Bukele y gana la oposición, los pandilleros saldrán de la cárcel. Ese ha sido como el eje de la campaña. A nivel económico, no hay una discusión seria sobre el futuro. Las condiciones económicas del país presentan un escenario bastante crítico, con poca inversión extranjera, con un alto endeudamiento, el costo de la vida muy alta. En algunos estudios que hemos realizado, los ciudadanos resienten la situación económica, dicen que que es el principal problema. Sin embargo, hay esperanza de que el presidente lo va a resolver en el futuro, así como resolvió el problema de la seguridad. Eso es parte también de un fenómeno de psicología social que le hemos llamado satisfacción vicariante. Es decir, hay una frustración, hay una expectativa eh, y, y en términos generales las cifras económicas, los datos económicos, macroeconómicos y microeconómicos nos dicen que estamos en un escenario bastante delicado, con un alto endeudamiento, con muchos pagos mm, por, eh, por resolver en el corto, mediano y largo plazo. El gobierno ha utilizado los fondos de pensiones para resolver algunos problemas, ha adquirido muchísima deuda en estos últimos 5 años, incluyendo la pandemia, casi 10.000 millones de dólares, y el pronóstico es muy reservado para el futuro. Y los propios datos del gobierno en las encuestas de hogares de propósitos múltiples oficiales indican que la pobreza ha aumentado eh, en una cifra considerable. Eh, entonces creo que eso es el gran desafío para Bukele del futuro. ¿Cómo va a resolver esto? ¿Con qué recursos? Si va a tener apoyo del Fondo Monetario Internacional. Las fuentes se están agotando de créditos y préstamos. Ya queda poco donde recurrir. eh, y, y el tema del Bitcoin, que era otra apuesta estratégica, no logró el despegue económico. El Bitcoin no creció, la gente no lo usa. Probablemente algunos economistas señalan que en un futuro eh, próximo eh, una solución para la crisis económica sea tokenizar la economía, crear un token digital para generar un encadenamiento comercial y económico local, en lugar de imprimir dinero como se hacía antes, producir alguna moneda digital, pero eso sería mm, probablemente lo más crítico para Bukele en el futuro, ¿verdad? La gente es muy sensible al tema económico porque hay una economía informal muy fuerte y de tokenizar la economía podría ser la caída del castillo de naipes.
Thank you, Oscar, for painting a picture of some of the issues on the campaign. Indeed, this has been a rather atypical campaign, and for also giving us some more detail on the economic uncertainties that confront Salvadorans. Leonor, I have a question for you, and we'll go out of order slightly. So I want to come to you, Leonor, and then I'll come to you, Maximo, and soon we'll open to questions from the audience. A friendly reminder, if you'd like to ask panelists a question, there's an Ask Live Questions, but Ask Questions button live on the event webpage. Go ahead and insert your question once you click on that button. Over to you, Leonor. So for 3 straight years, or nearly 3 straight years, El Salvador has been governed by the uninterrupted so-called state of exception. And it basically means that the state of exception is no longer exceptional. But I do have a question about what that might mean for election day. Is there any way in which some of the restrictions we've seen on civil liberties and rights to association that are a part of the state of exception meant to fight the gangs could affect the conditions on election day? And then the second part of the question is, after election day, to what extent do you think the state of exception continues to play a role in Bukele's political agenda in a second term?
Election day, the state of exception could be used to reduce the possibility of protest, of social movements, or anyone criticizing, because we should understand that the state of exception is not just a public security policy, but it's more a mechanism to impose fear and to control the population. Anyone in El Salvador knows by now that the state of exception, yes, it can be used to fight gun crime, gun-related crime, but it also can be used to basically put in jail anyone who seems like an enemy for the government. What could happen with the state of exception after the elections? At some point, the government might not need the state of exception anymore. So probably the Salvadorian Congress, the Legislative Assembly, will not renew it at some point. But we need to remember that the consequences of the state of exception will not extinguish just because the state of exception is not renewed. And why I say that? 2 reasons. One is that as part of the state of exception, many criminal reforms were implemented. So criminal laws has been changed in El Salvador in a way that they don't follow the due process standards anymore. And at the same time, El Salvador now has more than 70,000 people in jail. What's going to happen with this imprisoned people? It's not. There's no a clear path for how to solve that. So I think that the international community, along with civil society, will also have the opportunity to make proposals on how to address the implications, the consequences of the state of exception, even if this decree at some point is not renewed anymore.
Thank you, Leonor. Maximo, I want to ask you a question that gets us into the weeds a little bit. So we've mostly been discussing at a high level what the elections on February 4th will look like. And those are federal or national elections. But I want to note as well, since we're in the electoral context, that there are local level elections the following month on March 3rd. Are there any differences between the outcome of the ones on February 4th and what we anticipate to happen on March 3rd? Or are we largely going to see some of the, or most of the same political trend lines filter down to the local level as well?
Thank you, Ryan. And I'm glad that you asked this question, because it seems like everybody is forgetting about the municipal elections, right? Everybody's so focused on the presidential and the congressional elections that everybody is not even talking or remembering the municipal elections. And they are a very important aspect of this whole process. I personally think we won't see major changes on what the outcome will be in this first election, and then with the municipal elections on March 3rd. The reason is that, again, the opposition has been diminished largely by their own wrongdoings, and that has been very palpable at the local level. Now, there's still a few strongholds that the FLM still has in particular in the eastern part of the country, and Arena has one stronghold close by here to the capital city of San Salvador. But I think those few remaining strongholds for those two parties, I think they might be won by Nuevas Ideas this time around. So the other thing that you need to take in consideration, they have been jumps of ships that we have seen in some municipalities, you know, who were in the hands of the opposition and just felt overwhelmed, you know, with lack of response and support from the central government, just decided to rather join the winner, so to say, and in order to keep the peace. And we have seen that as well. So I think it's going to be an interesting election and a very important election, of course, now with the reduction of the municipalities in the country and how that will adjust. But I see it won't be very different than the outcome that we expect to see this Sunday. Remember, the Diaspora will not vote on the municipal elections. It's only applicable for the presidential and congressional elections. However, it will be certainly a very key and important election. And finally, Ryan, if you allow me just to jump back on the question you did to Leonor about the state of exception. As promoters of democracy and free election, I think it would have been a great message of goodwill to see at least a temporary suspension of the state of exception, at least during a few days prior and after the elections. This was something that the international community was asking for, wishing to see in order to sustain democratic values and give a free and fair opportunity and without fears of restraint and oppression to the opposition. But on the other hand, also the government arguments that it's to guarantee people a secure and peaceful election, right? That they have no fear to go and stand in a queue on elections day. I think it has some validity to it, but it would have been a good sign, at least a temporary suspension to avoid all those critical claims that made against the government. It would have been an easy way to avoid those. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that, Maximo. Really a nice addition as well on the state of exception. So we've gotten plenty of questions in our queue here, and it is time to move to the Q&A portion of our event. Again, if you've got a question, there's an Ask Live Questions button on the event webpage. Go ahead and put your question in there, and it will filter to me. We have about 11 minutes remaining, and I want to get through as many of these as possible. Our first question comes from our very own senior advisor at CSIS America's program, Mark Schneider, who asks if there is any reading of this election in El Salvador and the overall context that we've spent the last 50 minutes describing that would permit anyone to say that the elections have been free and fair. We have this debate endlessly in Latin America. What constitutes free and fair elections? A lot goes into it. Mark continues here. He says clearly that there were structural changes made within the past year, including constitutional re-election and the reduction of the mechanism for selecting deputies, et cetera, et cetera. In what way can we say that this election will be free and fair, or can we not say that this election will be free and fair? I think that's the crux of Mark's question. Who wants to take that one? I'm looking at you, Maximo. You're still muted.
You gave me the difficult one to answer.
It's a very hard question.
A very hard question, but a valid question. And I think it's something that's in the mind of many out there. Listen, Ryan, I would say the election will be free and fair because organizational-wise, the Elections Tribunal is doing what they can in what they have in their hands and what the current elections code allowed them to do. Could they have been more strict? Could they have been more inquiring on all these changes that came out of the National Assembly regarding the elections? They could have, but that will be for the history to judge, and we might see different action in future elections tribunal members. But as far as organizing the election, managing them, administering them, and allowing the citizens their rights of suffrage, I think we could say that the elections are free and fair. Now, changes have been done. There could be political intentions to all those changes that we've seen. But again, I think they have done their part, and it's up to history to judge if they did a good job or not. Now, it's difficult. It's difficult. The context that we're living in El Salvador. The limitations that the elections code brings. We don't have really a true elections law that could allow us to dig deeper. But we'll see. We'll see what comes out of this, Ryan. And there's always a good time after any election to think and review what was done good, what was done wrong, and what could be changed in the future. So I hope for that opportunity as well to come. Thank you.
Thanks, Maximo. The hardest question was the first question from our senior advisor, Mark Schneider. Moving on to another question about the constitutional changes that permitted Bukele to run for re-election. The question is that the same has been the case for many other countries in this region. Presidents such as Ortega in Nicaragua, Juan Orlando Hernandez in Honduras, and now Bukele, who has exercised a certain dominance over the judiciary, has made use of this power to ensure that the Supreme Court decides that acting presidents can be candidates again. The question is, how is this possible, and why does it happen with such frequency in our region, I think Central America, and what can be done about it? Leonor, do you have any thoughts on that? You mentioned the re-election in some of your responses.
This is a formula that many presidents in the region have used to try to legitimize his them staying in power even when the Constitution prohibits that. What happens is that the key institution for given at least an apparente, right, legality is the Supreme Courts. So the first move of presidents that want to stay in power for a really long time is that they co-opt the Supreme Courts. They elect magistrates that are people that will follow the script of the president, and that's why it's so important to work on to monitor the election of high courts, members of high courts, Supreme Courts, to guarantee that they are independent and that they will follow the Constitution and the international standards, and not to follow whatever the president wants. The second thing is that it's also important to educate the people to understand the dangers of plotting to support a president that wants to stay for a long time. If a president wants to rule a country based on not following the Constitution, so that's a bad sign. That is a bad sign. That means that that president could also break any other rule if that favors him. And we've seen that story so many times in our region. So we should not let this happen. One final thing is that many people are saying that Bukele and other presidents are only trying to run for a second term and not for an indefinite term. But we've seen in the region that staying for a second term against the Constitution, it every time leads of a president trying to stay longer. So we might see that in the Salvadorian Congress agenda of the coming years, we might see trying to change the Constitution for an indefinite term of the president.
Thank you very much, Leonor. Oscar, I have a question for you, and it comes from our senior advisor at CSIS America's program, Alex Kravitz, a fellow Salvadoran. What will be the effect of redistricting municipalities on the March electoral results? So we're talking about the local elections now. Who benefits and how?
Perdón, ¿me puedes repetir? Se está viendo un poquito bajo.
Sure. What will the effect be of redistricting municipalities on the March electoral results? Who benefits and how?
Casi, por alguna razón, casi no oigo bien. No sé qué es.
Perhaps we can go to you, Maximo, if you hear the question better. Oscar, we'll come back to you with a question.
Okay.
Maximo?
Yes, I think I alluded that a little bit at the beginning when I talked about the municipal elections. I mean, yes, there, like I said, there's a clear intention to have more control, so to say, at the municipal level by the reduction. I think it was thought with a political intention, but again, the realities of El Salvador also talk about we're a smaller country, we are a poor country, and is it necessary to have such a large decentralized system in order to have us functioning? So there's a lot at stake here, Ryan, but certainly we'll see. It's going to be harder, like I said, to the opposition, who still has a few remaining strongholds throughout the country, to sustain those. And now with this reduction, it's going to be even harder for them to do so.
Wonderful. I'm going to send the same question that I asked you, Maximo, in the chat to Oscar. He seems to be having some audio challenges, so that we can get Oscar's view on this as well.
Sí, ya pude leer la pregunta. ¿Me escuchan bien? Sí.
Sí.
Sí. Bueno, la redistribución de municipios lo que busca es la mayor concentración de poder, definitivamente. Hay dos reformas importantes. La reforma de reparto electoral, que cambia la fórmula estadística de cocientes y residuos por la fórmula de Hunt, que favorece a los conglomerados de datos mayores. Eso beneficia al Partido de Nuevas Ideas, y la reorganización de municipios también. En muchos municipios pequeños donde el liderazgo local favorecía la oposición. Eso creo que fue identificado y se diseñó una estrategia de distribución territorial fortaleciendo los grandes núcleos poblacionales y debilitando a los pequeños municipios, de tal forma que de 262 pasamos a 44. Hay un caso típico muy conocido que es el caso de La Libertad Este, donde hay una alcaldesa muy fuerte en antiguo Cuscatlán del partido Arena. Eh, en ese caso se unen 5 municipios: Huizúcar, Zaragoza, San José Villanueva, Nuevo Cuscatlán y Antiguo Cuscatlán, y digamos, su capacidad se debilita y el pronóstico es que pierda las elecciones y la gane el oficialismo. Esa fue la arquitectura que se diseñó para estas elecciones.
Thank you very much, Oscar. I note that we're at 11 Washington time, and unfortunately we have to leave it there. We've gotten plenty of other questions in the queue, but we'll have to leave it there. This has been a fascinating discussion. We've broken, I think, a lot of ground, covered rather a lot of ground, and broken open some new areas of insight. And as the panel revealed, the analysis is not over after February 4th. There are important elections that are following about a month after that. With also important dynamics that will shed light on where the country is heading. But for now, Oscar Picardo João, Director of the Institute of Science, Technology, and Innovation at Francisco Gavidia University, Máximo Zaldívar, Regional Director for Latin America at IFES, and Leonor Arteaga, Program Director with the Due Process of Law Foundation. Thank you very much for spending your last hour with us. It was a real pleasure to have you on this panel.
Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Ryan.